In the early decades of the 20th century, America discovered a strangely comforting idea that a little lithium in a lemon-lime soda might make childhood calmer, quieter, and, in theory, more pleasant for the adults who had to supervise it. When you hear that every child in America was essentially sipping a mild mood stabilizer with their afternoon treat, it sounds dramatic. But the truth, as always, is much sleepier. Parents weren't trying to medicate their children into compliance. They were mostly just trying to get through long days with unpredictable plumbing, unreliable refrigeration, and kids who had far too much unsupervised energy. And because no one read ingredient labels back then, because there were no ingredient labels back then, the situation drifted forward with all the urgency of a lukewarm carbonated drink left open on a table. It's easy to imagine the scene in a slow, quiet way. A dusty general store, a small icebox humming just enough to keep the bottles cool, and children wandering in with pennies that were probably supposed to be used for something more responsible. The shopkeeper wasn't thinking about pharmacology. He barely remembered to sweep. He simply cracked open bottle after bottle, handing them to kids who mostly wanted the tiny fizz that felt like electricity on the tongue. The lithium citrate inside the formula wasn't a secret. It was printed right there in the promotional materials. But the promotional materials also claimed it would cheer you up, which sounded wholesome enough to a population that had just lived through food adulteration scandals involving things like sawdust and plaster. Lithium seemed practically refined by comparison. Parents noticed their children seemed, if not happier, then at least more manageable. A little less shouting across the yard, a little less arguing about chores, a little more quiet time in the late afternoon when the heat made everyone lethargic anyway. No one questioned it because questioning required energy, and most adults had already spent that energy lifting heavy objects, washing laundry by hand, or trying to keep chickens alive long enough to lay eggs. It was a period in which the phrase "good enough" did a lot of heavy lifting. And if a lemon-lime soda happened to take the edge off a rambunctious Saturday, well, that was simply one less thing to worry about. Doctors, meanwhile, existed in a sort of parallel universe. Some knew lithium as a mineral salt used for mood disorders. Others barely remembered it from medical school. The science was hazy, and the regulations even hazier. But there was a prevailing belief that if something came from the earth, it couldn't be too harmful. This belief, though comforting, was not especially accurate. Still, with no federal agency fully empowered to investigate consumer products, the drink sailed peacefully along, its bubbles rising and popping with the calm insistence of something that assumed it would never be questioned. Children kept drinking it through holidays, fairs, summers spent outside, and winters spent indoors pretending to be busy. Generations learned to associate that particular citrus sweetness with treat-like joy, unaware that it came with a trace mineral that modern parents would probably have several meetings about. Kids traded the bottles like treasures, sometimes saving the caps as if they were valuable artifacts. None of them felt particularly strange, because normal is whatever everyone around you is doing at the same time. And if everyone was drinking lithium, then lithium simply became the background hum of the era. Eventually, of course, regulations arrived, slowly, politely, almost apologetically. Labels appeared. Ingredients were scrutinized with a little more skepticism. The soda formula shifted towards something milder, something that wouldn't raise eyebrows at town meetings. Children barely noticed the difference. They still ran around, still caused trouble, still invented games that were probably unsafe by modern standards. The world kept moving, even as the lithium quietly vanished from the shelves, leaving behind only stories that sound dramatic now, but felt entirely mundane to the people living them. Looking back, the whole situation has a sleepy charm to it. A national moment defined not by scandal or outrage, but by a collective shrug weighted with fatigue. Parents did what they could, children drank what they were given, and 7-Up, with its brief experiment in therapeutic carbonation, drifted through history like a forgotten footnote that somehow became a punchline. The truth is that life then was full of quiet compromises, many of which felt perfectly reasonable until someone came along decades later and asked, very softly, "Wait, the kids were drinking what?" And so the question, the soft, slow one that drifts in only after the fact, is how something that unusual ever felt ordinary. But the more you look at that era, the more obvious it becomes that quiet oddities were simply part of the landscape. People trusted tonics that claimed to fix everything from headaches to heartbreak. They trusted advertisements with glowing promises and chemical ingredients no one could pronounce. They trusted that if something were truly dangerous, surely someone with a clipboard would have intervened. Though, in reality, clipboards were mostly used to list farming supplies and debts owed at the general store. Regulation was not the era's strong point. Survival was. The rhythm of daily life didn't leave much time for reflection anyway. A typical morning began with chores, each one repetitive enough to be soothing if you didn't think too hard about it. Children fed animals, hauled water, and endured shoes that wore out faster than they grew. By the time they reached the store for a small treat, they weren't pondering mineral compounds or long-term health effects. They were just tired, warm, and hoping for something sweet. A drink that lifted the mood even a little felt like a tiny miracle, the kind people accepted without any need to ask questions. Adults, too, were in a different mental space than modern parents. They expected childhood to come with bumps, bruises, and a handful of concerning mishaps. A soda with lithium didn't even make the top 10 list of things worth worrying about. They worried more about whether a storm would ruin the crops or whether the roof would hold through the next winter. In that context, the idea of a calming beverage was almost comforting. If it made the children argue less near bedtime, that alone felt like a blessing. There was also a cultural quietness around science. Many people had only the vaguest idea of what doctors actually did, and doctors didn't always help by explaining things clearly. Medical knowledge existed in a fog of partial understanding, word-of-mouth wisdom, and treatments handed down by habit rather than research. A drink with lithium simply blended into the fog, another indistinct shape drifting by. No alarms sounded, no articles went viral, because newspapers cared more about train schedules than chemical additives. Children growing up in this era experienced the world in a slow, tactile way. Days stretched out, marked by chores, weather, and the occasional small adventure. The soda was just part of the background, something they reached for without thinking. If it made them feel slightly more content during long summer afternoons when the heat pressed down like a quilt, they accepted that sensation as natural. Childhood didn't have the constant stimulation it has now. A gentle lift in mood felt subtle enough to go unnoticed. By the time lithium was removed from the drink, children had moved on to other preoccupations: school, chores, new games invented with sticks, and improbable rules. Parents accepted the reformulation with hardly a sigh. The drink tasted similar enough. It was still fizzy. It was still a way to cool down after hours spent outdoors. Life continued with its soft, repetitive hum, unbothered by the small chemical adjustment. The memory of the lithium era faded in that same gentle way. It became something people only remembered when prompted, the kind of detail that emerges decades later during a slow conversation on a porch. Someone would mention the old formula, someone else would pause, and then they'd shrug as if to say, "Yes, that was strange, but so were many things back then." The past is not a tidy place. It's full of quiet oddities that only appear remarkable when viewed from far away, through a modern lens that has decided to care. And that's the real heart of this sleepy history. A reminder that most people don't notice the peculiarities of their own era. They move through life doing what everyone else is doing, accepting the ordinary shape of things without worrying too much about it. Whether or not that shape contains a trace of lithium is almost beside the point in the moment. It only becomes interesting later when someone finally slows down enough to look back and ask, with a tired, amused softness, "How did anyone think that was normal?" And when that question drifts in, the gentle, delayed wonder of hindsight, it doesn't land with outrage so much as a kind of drowsy amusement. Because the more you examine the era, the more you realize that normal was never built from logic. It was built from habit, exhaustion, and a quiet hope that whatever everyone else was doing must be reasonably safe. People trusted proximity more than science. If their neighbors were giving the same soda to their children, then the drink became part of a shared cultural shrug, the kind that spreads through an entire country without anyone needing to say a word. Even the advertisements of the time carried a sleepy confidence. They weren't loud or aggressive. They simply suggested, in a calm, reassuring tone, that the drink might lift your spirits. Not cure anything, not change the world, just gently brighten the fog of everyday life. And to a population that endured long workdays, unpredictable weather, and constant manual labor, that promise felt almost luxurious. A lift. A small, quiet lift. It was enough. The children, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the entire situation. They tore through their days with the steady determination of creatures who have not yet learned what consequences are. They drank the soda and went right back to their games, running barefoot on uneven ground, inventing rules that changed every 5 minutes, arguing with the kind of soft ferocity only kids can manage. If the lithium softened their moods, it did so in the gentlest, most unremarkable way. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a slightly smoother version of an already simple childhood. Adults didn't keep track of how much their kids consumed. They didn't think in terms of milligrams or daily recommended limits. They bought the bottles as they bought everything else, reactively, casually, guided by whatever the store happened to have in stock. And since the drink tasted good and didn't cause immediate disaster, it earned their quiet approval. Life was measured by immediate cause and effect, by whether something worked today, not whether it would be questioned 50 years later. The calmness of it all is what feels most foreign to modern eyes. Today, every minor decision triggers research, debate, conflicting articles, and a recommended list of alternatives. But the world that drank lithium soda was slower, heavier, and much less suspicious. People didn't assume danger lurked in every bottle. They assumed the bottle was fine because everything else they consumed, including their water, was often more questionable. By comparison, the soda seemed almost refined. The transition away from the lithium formula happened with equal quiet. No dramatic bans, no moral panic. Just a gentle course correction as new regulations began putting names and numbers where guesswork had once lived. Ingredient labels arrived like polite reminders. Public health became a little less optional, and the soda quietly changed its recipe, slipping into a more harmless place in the national pantry. If a child happened to notice the taste shift, the adults brushed it off as imagination. If an adult noticed the absence of that unusually calming afterglow, they likely blamed the weather, or the week, or their own tiredness. Life was full of variables. Removing lithium from a drink barely registered among them. But the strangest part, strange in a soft, understated way, is how quickly the memory evaporated. Within a generation, no one talked about it. Bottles from the original era still existed, but they sat on high shelves or in old basements, covered in dust, their labels faded. The story only re-emerged in the modern age when someone dug it up and said, "Wait, they put what in children's soda?" And modern listeners, conditioned to expect chaos in the smallest details, reacted with a mix of disbelief and sleepy fascination. That fascination isn't really about the lithium. It's about the quiet reminder that the past wasn't as distant as it feels. It was full of people doing their best, making oddly calm decisions, and trusting the world a little more than perhaps they should have. And somehow, that trust created an era in which handing a child a bottle of mood-stabilizing soda felt no stranger than handing them a cookie. It all blended into a soft, hazy normal, one that only becomes remarkable when we look back slowly, blinking, as if waking from a long nap. And the more slowly you look back, the more the entire episode feels like a quiet lesson in how ordinary strangeness can become. Not because people were reckless, but because life moved at a pace that left little room for questioning. You accepted what was in front of you, especially if it tasted good and caused no immediate harm. The world was full of rough edges, broken tools, inconsistent heat, illnesses that traveled through towns without asking permission. Compared to all that, a fizzy drink with a mood-softening mineral barely registered as an item worth thought. Even the companies behind the soda seemed almost sleepy in their confidence. Their marketing was mild, polite, and deeply trusting of the public's willingness to believe the best. There were no bright warnings, no clinical claims, just gentle suggestions that the drink might brighten one's spirit. A lift in mood sounded wholesome, even moral. People in that era were not chasing excitement. They were chasing manageable days. If a beverage promised a hint of calm, they welcomed it with the quiet enthusiasm of people who had very little else promising ease. Children experienced all this through an even softer lens. They didn't have the language for ingredients or minerals or side effects. They only had the sensations of their bodies, the rhythm of the afternoons, the warmth of the sun settling low after hours of running, climbing, and arguing about rules no adult cared about. The drink slipped into those afternoons like a habitual pause, cool, sweet, and undramatic. It was simply part of their small universe, no more questionable than the uneven ground or the splintered fences they leaned on. Parents, for their part, were not careless. They were simply exhausted. Child-rearing in that era relied less on theory and more on endurance. You loved your children by keeping them fed, clothed, and marginally safe from the more immediate dangers. Wells without barriers, fires without guards, animals with unpredictable moods. A soda, whatever it contained, did not rise to the level of concern. Worry was a resource, and adults could only spend it on the most urgent matters. A calming drink was not a problem. It was a convenience. What makes the story feel dreamlike now is that nothing dramatic happened to end it. No sudden studies, no alarming headlines, just a gradual shift in the quiet machinery of public health. New rules, new expectations, new labels. A soft but steady belief that people deserved to know what they were consuming. The soda companies adjusted as gently as they had once advertised, changing formulas, altering claims, stepping into a new era without much resistance. Their product remained on shelves, still sweet, still fizzy, simply stripped of the mineral that had once given it a peculiar charm. For families, the shift barely rippled the surface of daily life. Children grew, adults aged, seasons passed. The bottle tasted a little different, perhaps, but the world didn't pause to acknowledge it. Life in that era flowed forward with a kind of slow inevitability, carried on the backs of routine and repetition. By the time anyone thought to wonder about the lithium, it had already faded into a quiet corner of history. And that is why the story feels so gently surreal today. Not shocking, not alarming, just quietly unbelievable. A reminder that the past is filled with small oddities that slipped by unnoticed because no one had the time or energy to examine them closely. People trusted the familiar. They trusted what was available. They trusted the quiet assumption that if something were truly dangerous, someone else would intervene. Looking back, the episode feels less like a scandal and more like a lullaby from a different era. A calm, slow assurance that the world made a certain kind of sense, even when it didn't. A sense built not on certainty, but on repetition, on habit, on the belief that if everyone is doing the same thing, it must be fine. And in that sleepy, collective belief, an entire generation of children sipped their lemon-lime lithium without ever realizing they were part of a story that future generations would retell with a soft, bemused whisper. They really drank that? And the more you linger on that whisper, the clearer it becomes that the entire episode sits somewhere between harmless curiosity and gentle disbelief. Not dramatic enough for scandal, not dangerous enough for panic. Simply one of those quiet historical footnotes that feels stranger the longer you think about it. But people at the time didn't think about it. They didn't analyze. They didn't compare notes. They moved through their days with the steady rhythm of a society still shaped more by effort than information. Most families had no access to medical journals, and even if they did, they likely wouldn't have had the energy to make sense of them after long hours of labor. News traveled slowly, often softened by retelling, trimmed by memory, or reshaped by personal belief. A new ingredient, a mineral, a claim printed on a soda advertisement, these things didn't register as important. They were just part of the white noise of life, the same way the creaking of wooden floors or the hum of insects on a hot evening became part of the backdrop. What makes the lithium story so quietly fascinating is how utterly normal it felt while it was happening. Children didn't appear unusually sedated or mysteriously calm. They still fought over marbles, still wandered off where they shouldn't, still got into the kind of minor trouble that kept parents half worried and half resigned. If the lithium had any effect at all, it blended seamlessly into the natural ebb and flow of childhood moods. No one documented sudden changes because no one expected them. Moods shifted all the time in that era, mostly because kids were hungry, tired, overstimulated by weather, or annoyed by chores. Adults, too, wove the drink into the texture of their routines without ceremony. A bottle for a child after a long day outside. A bottle for an adult after an even longer day inside. Not to unwind, not to self-medicate, just because it was cool, slightly sweet, and a small relief in a life built around constant work. Most people didn't even finish their bottles in one sitting. They opened them, drank a bit, set them down, and wandered off to attend to whatever task was calling next. In a way, the lithium wasn't just unnoticed, it was almost neglected. This quiet neglect is what makes the eventual disappearance of the mineral feel equally unremarkable. As regulations shifted and formulas changed, the soda remained, and that was enough. The taste was close enough to what people expected, the bubbles still tickled the tongue, and the drink still provided that symbolic pause in the day, a brief, fizzy moment that separated one task from the next. No one felt loss. No one felt relief. The era simply adjusted itself, like a landscape slowly reshaped by a long, gentle rain. Decades later, when historians and curious minds rediscovered the ingredient lists of early sodas, the reaction was less outrage and more a kind of drowsy amusement. People shook their heads slowly, as if trying to line up the modern world with a past that now seemed impossibly trusting. But the truth is that life then required trust. Trust in neighbors, trust in shopkeepers, trust in products, trust in the hope that whatever was on the shelves would do more good than harm. Not because people were naive, but because constant skepticism was a luxury they could not afford. In the end, what remains is not the shock of children drinking something mildly pharmaceutical, but the quiet reminder of how different the tempo of life once was. A world where people didn't inspect everything, didn't question everything, didn't have the time or tools to dissect every ingredient. A world where a soda was just a soda, even if it contained something that now raises eyebrows. And perhaps that is why the story lingers with such a soft, dreamy quality. It feels almost like a collective sleepwalk through an era that trusted its own simplicity, an era that didn't know it was creating strange anecdotes for future generations. An era that drifted forward with gentle confidence, letting small oddities pass unexamined. When you look back at it now, through the quiet haze of hindsight, it doesn't feel alarming. It feels like watching a distant scene through a dusty window, strange, calm, and slightly unreal. A reminder that history is full of moments where ordinary people lived ordinary days, unaware that later generations would pause, rub their eyes, and ask softly, almost affectionately, how did that ever seem normal? And the softer you ask that question, the more it becomes clear that normal is never a stable thing. It drifts. It reshapes itself. It expands to absorb the small absurdities of any era until those absurdities become invisible. The Lithium in 7-Up story only feels bizarre now because we live in a world trained to notice every minor detail. Back then, noticing was optional. Survival wasn't. Most families in that era didn't accumulate memories the way we do now, with photos, videos, digital experiments, online debates. Their memories formed in quieter ways, often tied to sensory impressions. The clink of glass bottles, the dusty smell of general stores, the slow fizz rising in warm air. The drink wasn't a topic of conversation, it was an ambient detail. Something you remembered only when you were thirsty. Something you forgot as soon as a chore pulled you away. In that sense, the Lithium lived its entire public life in the background, unnoticed by the very people consuming it. What's also striking is how unremarkable the transition felt when it finally ended. When Lithium quietly disappeared from the formula, no one held on to their old bottles as relics. No one warned their children that the taste would never be quite the same. Life didn't allow for nostalgia over beverage ingredients. The average person of the time barely had the luxury to reflect on yesterday's weather, let alone yesterday's drink. Change was constant and often subtle, slipping in without fanfare. New tools, new recipes, new expectations brought in by the slow churn of modernization. If you imagine a household at the moment of this shift, the scene is almost comically mild. A parent unscrews a new bottle, takes a sip, and maybe, just maybe, pauses for a moment at the slightly altered taste. They squint, shrug, and hand it to a child already halfway out the door. The child drinks, feels nothing unusual, and keeps running. That's the entire drama. A global change rendered completely anticlimactic by the tempo of ordinary life. And maybe that's why the story has gained such a sleepy charm in the present day. It's not a tale of negligence or corruption or danger. It's a tale of quiet coexistence between people and a beverage that was doing something mildly unusual. The lithium didn't transform society. It didn't create national trends or strange behaviors. It simply existed, calmly, diffused through glass bottles, until someone eventually decided it didn't need to. The modern mind wants to assign meaning to everything. It wants to imagine dramatic outcomes or secret consequences or some hidden cultural shift powered by medicated soda. But history doesn't always satisfy those impulses. Sometimes it offers nothing more than a quiet quirk, a small footnote, an oddly gentle memory of an era that lived at a slower emotional frequency. The kind of detail that makes you smile faintly in disbelief, not because it was wild, but because it was so utterly mundane to the people who lived through it. You can almost picture the last generation of kids who drank the lithium formula. Not historical figures, not symbols, just ordinary children whose names never made it into any archive. Running barefoot across uneven yards, hair tangled by wind, clothes stained by grass, holding cold glass bottles against their cheeks on hot afternoons. They didn't know they were participating in anything unusual. They didn't know they were part of a future anecdote. They were simply alive in the soft, unhurried way children were alive back then. And when you finally view the moment through that frame, the entire episode stops feeling strange at all. It becomes just another instance of humans navigating their world with limited information, imperfect tools, and a surprisingly deep well of trust. A reminder that the past is not defined by what people didn't know, but by how gently and confidently they moved through life despite not knowing. Eventually, the lithium story settles into place the same way the drink's bubbles once settled in their bottles, rising briefly, shimmering, and then fading into something quiet, calm, and almost tender. Not a warning, not a moral lesson, just a softly glowing fragment of history that drifts into view long enough for us to blink at it, smile a little, and then let it float back into the haze. And once it drifts back into that haze, the story begins to feel less like a historical oddity and more like a gentle reminder of how humans have always improvised their way through life. The people drinking that soda weren't making choices based on science or risk analysis. They were simply choosing whatever made a long day feel slightly easier. In a world without constant noise, without endless streams of warnings, without the hum of digital vigilance, a fizzy lemon drink seemed like the least complicated pleasure anyone could ask for. There's a quiet comfort in imagining that world, one where decisions were made with a kind of slow practicality rather than anxious calculation. If a product tasted good and didn't seem to harm anyone, then it earned its place in the pantry. No one dissected it. No one doubted it. Parents didn't hover, doctors didn't intervene, and children didn't question what was handed to them. It was an era when life felt solid, predictable, and grounded in repetition, even though so many of its details now seem slightly unreal. And maybe that unreality is what makes the lithium story linger so softly in modern minds. We're accustomed to believing that the past was rough and chaotic, but we forget how calmly people adapted to that roughness. They woke up early, worked until they were tired, ate whatever was available, and trusted the world around them to be mostly benign. If something unexpected happened, they handled it. If nothing happened, they didn't go looking for problems. The lithium in the soda, like so many quiet quirks of early consumer culture, slipped through their days without ever announcing itself. The children of that era, now long grown or long gone, probably wouldn't even remember the taste difference. They would remember the glass bottles, the clatter of crates, the feel of something cold against their palms in the heat of summer. They might remember the pattern of sunlight through the store window, the slow dust motes drifting in the air, the little whistle the bottle made when opened too quickly. The drink was part of the environment, not an experience to reflect on. Childhood memory tends to hold on to sensations, not ingredients. And as the generations passed, new beverages arrived, new regulations appeared, and the strange, calm chapter of lithium soda was folded neatly away. Only when historians and nostalgic enthusiasts dug through old advertisements did the story re-emerge, drifting back into the present like a soft echo. It didn't provoke outrage, just a slow exhale of disbelief, the kind where people shake their heads gently and smile at the oddness of it all. Because what the story truly reveals is not recklessness, but trust. a broad, almost serene trust in the everyday materials of life. A trust that the products on the shelves, the advice printed in newspapers, and the habits handed down through families were good enough. And in many ways, that trust shaped the emotional landscape of the era more than any ingredient ever could. When we look back now, it's tempting to judge the past with the sharpness of modern knowledge. But the more softly you look, the more the edges blur, and the more understandable everything becomes. People were tired. People were hopeful. People did their best with what they had. And if what they had was a soda that quietly carried an unexpected mineral, then that simply became part of the quiet rhythm of their days. In the end, the lithium story doesn't stand out because it was extreme. It stands out because it was so strangely calm. A national quirk wrapped in gentle normalcy. A moment in history that feels less like a headline and more like a drowsy anecdote shared late at night, when the world feels still and the past feels impossibly close. A reminder that human life has always been a mixture of trust, improvisation, and the occasional quietly bizarre detail that only future generations will bother to notice. And the more you settle into that late-night feeling, the easier it is to understand why no one noticed anything unusual. Life back then didn't invite scrutiny, it invited endurance. People didn't study their own habits the way we do now. They didn't zoom out to look at patterns. They simply woke up, moved through the long stretch of the day, and tried to end it with enough energy left to do it again tomorrow. Anything that smoothed the edges, even slightly, fit naturally into that rhythm. The lithium soda was one of those small smoothing agents, hidden in plain sight. It didn't transform moods dramatically. It didn't make children serene or unusually compliant. It was subtle in the way life's background comforts often are. A cooling drink on a hot day. A moment of sweetness in a life that didn't offer much sweetness. A small, quiet lift that blended seamlessly into the texture of ordinary afternoons. If you imagine those afternoons now, they come into focus slowly, as if through a soft filter. Children sprawled on porches after running until they were breathless. Adults resting briefly before returning to chores that refused to end. The clink of glass bottles as someone opened a crate. A vague hum of conversation drifting from kitchen windows. Nothing sharp, nothing urgent. Just the steady flow of a society used to working hard and feeling tired in a deeply physical way. In that kind of world, even the extraordinary becomes ordinary. A new chemical in a drink? A new tonic selling vague promises? A strange new remedy printed in the newspaper? All of these slipped into daily life with barely a ripple. People were not naive, they simply had different priorities. You didn't worry about additives when your real concerns were weather, illness, and whether the next harvest would be good enough. Compared to those, the contents of a soda bottle barely registered. What's charming, in a sleepy way, is how uncurious everyone seemed. If someone today discovered their child was drinking a mood-altering mineral with their soft drink, the news would spread instantly. Messages, warnings, think pieces, arguments. But in the early 20th century, the moment came and went without anyone raising their voice. Curiosity took energy, and energy was always in short supply. When lithium eventually disappeared from the formula, the shift happened so quietly that it barely counted as an event. A new recipe, a slight change in taste, a passing comment like, this one's a bit different, followed by a shrug and a return to chores. The children didn't pause. The adults didn't analyze. Life stayed in motion. What the past leaves behind, then, is not a sense of shock, but a sense of softness. The kind of softness that feels almost dreamlike when viewed from the present. A reminder that everyday life used to absorb absurdity without protest, folding it gently into routine. People weren't ignoring danger. They were trusting the ordinary shape of their world to hold steady for them. And that's really what makes the lithium story so compelling. Not the ingredient itself, but the calm acceptance that surrounded it. A collective willingness to let small mysteries pass unexamined. A belief that if something felt normal today, it would continue feeling normal tomorrow. When you picture that world now, it doesn't feel irresponsible. It feels slow, human, so deeply grounded in the rhythm of the tangible, weather, seasons, chores, meals, that the invisible details simply drifted by unnoticed. There's something oddly comforting about that. a gentle reminder that not every era was built on vigilance. Some were built on trust, even when that trust seems misplaced in hindsight. And maybe that's why the story resurfaces so easily in modern minds. It isn't a warning. It isn't a scandal. It's a sleepy anecdote from a time when life moved at a pace that allowed oddities to blend into the background. A reminder that history is full of small, drowsy surprises, moments that slip between the cracks and reappear only when someone takes the time to look back, slowly, softly, asking the kind of question you only whisper, "Did they really drink that?" And the softer that question lingers, the more the whole episode begins to resemble a long, slow exhale from a country that didn't yet know how closely it would one day examine itself. Back then, life wasn't something people dissected. It was something they carried, heavily, patiently, and with the kind of resignation that comes from spending most days outdoors, in weather that rarely asked for permission. In a world like that, anything that offered even the faintest suggestion of comfort became part of the landscape, unquestioned simply because questioning took more energy than anyone had available. The lithium soda, in that sense, was not a curiosity but a convenience, a small, ready-made reprieve, a bottled moment of calm tucked neatly between chores, errands, and the quiet chaos of managing a household without machines or schedules that behaved consistently. Parents didn't read ingredients because ingredients were not part of their vocabulary. They read results, and the result was that kids seemed slightly steadier, slightly less irritable, slightly easier to shepherd through a long day. Nothing miraculous, just manageable. And manageable, in that era, was a form of grace. Children, meanwhile, inhabited that world with a kind of unfiltered immediacy. They didn't wonder what was in the bottle any more than they wondered what was in the dust they kicked up while running. Their lives were shaped by sensation, not analysis. Warm boards under bare feet, cool shade under porches, the sting of a splinter, the sweetness of a drink handed to them without explanation. The lithium was invisible to them, as invisible as the small uncertainties that filled adult life but never quite spilled over into explanation. If anyone had paused long enough to think about it, which, realistically, no one did, they might have found the whole situation slightly curious. But even curiosity needed to yield to practicality. When days stretched out like slow-moving rivers and the only real urgency came from the sun going down before all the work was done, there wasn't much room left for abstract concerns. The drink tasted fine. It caused no immediate harm. It fit neatly into the rhythm of life, and so it stayed. And that's what makes the disappearance of lithium feel so poetic in hindsight. It didn't arrive with drama, and it didn't leave with drama. Regulations tightened, expectations shifted, labels appeared like polite footnotes. Scientists finally had the time and the funding to wonder if perhaps the mineral didn't belong in a children's beverage. And just like that, the era changed. Not abruptly, not loudly, just quietly. The way a long summer day fades into evening without anyone marking the exact moment the light softens. By the time the formula changed, the world had already begun speeding up in ways people didn't yet understand. Cities grew louder, information became sharper, trust became thinner. Consumers learned to squint at labels, and companies learned to justify themselves. But the old world, the lithium world, remained tucked somewhere in the national memory, soft around the edges, like the pages of a book left too long in the sun. Today, when the story resurfaces, it arrives with a gentle, comedic absurdity. People shake their heads slowly, amused not by danger, but by the sheer calmness of it all. It becomes a kind of whispered relic, a quiet reminder that the past was not merely stranger, it was slower, softer, more willing to let small oddities drift through without demanding an explanation. And maybe that's why it feels so soothing to think about now. It's a reminder that human beings once lived in a world where trust was the default and scrutiny was the exception. A world where a soda could contain something surprising, and the surprise wouldn't be discovered for decades because no one had the time or the inclination to look too closely. In the end, the lithium story isn't about chemistry. It's about pace. About a time when life moved slowly enough for an entire generation to sip something slightly unusual without ever realizing it was unusual at all. And when you think about it long enough, in the same slow rhythm the story deserves, the whole thing feels less like a mistake and more like an oddly tender chapter from a world that has long since drifted away, leaving only this soft, sleepy echo behind. And as that sleepy echo stretches a little further, the whole episode begins to feel like one of those memories you're not sure you lived or dreamed. The kind that surfaces unexpectedly when the day is quiet and your mind starts wandering. Because nothing about the lithium era was loud. Nothing was shocking. It was all so gently woven into the fabric of daily life that even now, trying to retell it requires slowing down to match its original pace. Most people imagine history as a series of big events, headlines, and turning points. But the truth is that entire decades pass in the form of small habits, unnoticed routines, little conveniences that slip in and stay simply because no one objects. A drink with a mood-stabilizing mineral was one of those habits. It didn't represent a cultural revolution. It didn't create any. It was just there, part of the quiet machinery of living. You can practically feel the texture of those years if you sit still enough. The uneven sidewalks, the slow clatter of horse hooves on distant streets, the low hum of voices in small shops. A world with fewer explanations but more acceptance. A world that didn't demand perfect clarity in order to keep moving. In that world, a soda was a soda. Its sweetness mattered far more than its composition. Parents didn't pace aisles reading labels because aisles didn't exist in the modern sense. Stores were simple, cramped, and full of things people bought out of habit, not research. Trust was currency. If a merchant sold it, if a neighbor drank it, if a family member liked it, that was enough. No one held their bottles up to the light and wondered whether the beverage had pharmaceutical aspirations. They held their bottles up to the light because it looked pretty. That was the entire analysis. Children, for their part, existed in that liminal space between boredom and imagination. The soda wasn't an indulgence, it was punctuation, something to mark the middle of a long afternoon, something to break the monotony of sweeping yards, pulling weeds, or inventing strangely competitive games with discarded sticks. They weren't calmer because of the lithium. They were calmer because childhood itself had long, quiet stretches built in. They drank the soda, felt a little refreshed, and continued running until the light faded. As for the manufacturers, they moved with the same slow confidence as everyone else. Their understanding of chemistry was partial, their understanding of consumer expectations even more so. But they weren't trying to hide anything. If anything, they were proud. They believed lithium made their drink sophisticated, scientific, modern in the faint, early way modern existed back then. Their advertisements didn't shout, they suggested, gently, sleepily, as if even the marketing had been lifted by the mineral. Eventually, of course, knowledge sharpened. Regulation gained momentum. People began to look closely at the world, the way someone squints after waking from a long nap. Familiar things began to seem strange. Familiar habits began to feel outdated. And the lithium quietly slipped out of the formula like a guest who realizes their presence is no longer required. No one protested. No one mourned. Life simply accepted the change and kept moving, because life always does. And now, when the story reappears in modern conversations, it does so with a soft sense of amusement. Not outrage, not fear. Just a gentle realization that the past was full of these calm peculiarities, so ordinary to the people living them, so oddly enchanting to us now. We laugh, not because it was absurd, but because it was so quietly, peacefully unquestioned. If anything, the story reminds us that human beings have always lived in a haze of partial understanding, relying on trust to fill the gaps. And that trust, however misplaced, created a world where children could drink something mildly medicinal without anyone blinking. A world slower than ours, softer than ours. A world that feels almost like a dim memory, one you can only revisit by quieting your mind and letting the details drift in, like dust motes moving lazily through a sunbeam. A world where, for a brief, drowsy moment in history, every child in America sipped something they didn't understand, and no one thought to ask if they should. And the more you picture that sunbeam, the more the whole memory settles into something almost tender. Not because it was wise, or careful, or admirable, just because it was so profoundly human. People moving through their days with quiet assumptions, children following whatever rhythm the adults set. A world where small oddities slipped into place and stayed there, undisturbed, simply because no one had the time or the vocabulary to pry them loose. If anything, the lithium era feels like a portrait of how gently people once interacted with the unknown. They didn't fear it. They didn't obsess over it. They let it coexist with the familiar, trusting that the world wouldn't hand them anything truly dangerous without a warning sign. Though, of course, the world rarely provided warnings. Information back then didn't flood people. It trickled, slow and uncertain, like water finding its way through cracks. You only learned what you learned when life insisted on teaching you. The drink never insisted. It sat quietly on wooden shelves, clinking in crates, cooling in ice boxes. A background detail, a minor character in a long, slow play where everyone focused on bigger, louder problems. Weather, money, illness, crops, the restless churn of daily survival. Childhood wasn't micromanaged. It wasn't optimized. It wasn't evaluated. It simply unfolded in long stretches of time, punctuated by chores, mischief, and the occasional small treat. The soda fit neatly into that rhythm, unimportant, uncomplicated, unexamined. And perhaps that's why the story feels so comforting now. Not because it was safe, but because it belonged to an era where life didn't fracture into constant decisions. People accepted what they could not control. They didn't try to fix every detail. They didn't ask whether each object in their lives met some modern threshold of purity. They lived with whatever the world handed them, trusting the quiet continuity of their routines. Even the children who drank the lithium soda likely carried no memory of ever questioning it. Ask one of them now, someone who has somehow lived long enough to look back, and they would probably laugh softly, shrug, and say something like, "It was just what we had." Not because that answer is historical, but because it's true. The past rarely explains itself. It just sits where it sat, unchanged, waiting for someone in the future to rediscover it and tilt their head in amused disbelief. By the time modern generations began collecting these oddities, dusty advertisements, old formulas, fragments of forgotten practices, the story had already transformed from lived experience into quiet folklore. Something passed around not as a warning, but as a reminder of how gently strange the world can be. A world that didn't try to justify itself. A world that trusted its own simplicity, even when that simplicity drifted uncomfortably close to absurdity. And, in a sleepy way, that simplicity becomes the point. Because the lithium soda wasn't a scandal. It wasn't an oversight. It was just one more example of life unfolding without anyone needing everything to make perfect sense. People accepted mystery the way they accepted weather, quietly, with a tired shrug, knowing there were more urgent things to worry about. Looking back, we have the luxury of amusement. We can trace the oddities, connect the dots, and marvel at the calmness with which entire generations lived their lives. But the people inside those lives weren't marveling. They were simply breathing, working, raising children, and holding on to whatever small comforts made a long day feel slightly more bearable. And so the story of lithium in a children's soda becomes less about chemistry and more about atmosphere, about the texture of a slower world, about the gentle absurdity that emerges whenever humans improvise their way through history. A world where no one read labels because there were no labels. A world where no one questioned the drink because questioning wasn't a habit. A world that trusted itself, quietly, imperfectly, and with a kind of drowsy confidence we almost envy now. A world that seems impossible today, yet undeniably real. A world that reminds us, softly, how much of history was lived without anyone ever noticing it was becoming history. And the more you think about that, how most history was lived without anyone realizing it, the more the lithium story settles into place as something almost inevitable. Not because it made sense, but because life back then depended on a kind of slow-motion trust. People didn't peer behind curtains. They didn't dissect motives. They didn't assume danger in every direction. They let the world present itself as it was, and they moved through it with a weary practicality that feels almost ancient now. There's a kind of quiet poetry in imagining those days. The creak of floorboards in small grocery shops, the soft thud of crates being set down, glass bottles sweating in summer heat, children pressing their thumbs against the wet glass just to feel the coolness seep into their skin. No one looked at the label, because the label wasn't there. The bottle didn't offer explanations. It offered refreshment. And refreshment, in a world without air conditioning, was reason enough. Parents, meanwhile, were locked into their own steady loops of responsibility. They didn't have time to stand still. They didn't have the luxury to question every new product that appeared on the shelf. Their lives were governed by tasks that asked for completion, not contemplation. If the soda tasted good and quieted a squabble or two, it found a place in the household. Not in a spotlight, just on the table, next to whatever else needed to be done. If there was a subtle calmness in the children who drank it, it blended perfectly into the natural backdrop of the era. The slower metabolism of long days, the fatigue of constant outdoor play, the heavy warmth of summers without mechanical relief. Moodiness itself had a different pace back then. It rose slowly, faded slowly, and rarely demanded an immediate solution. Lithium wasn't smoothing out modern restlessness. It was drifting through a world that already operated at half speed. The soda companies, of course, believed they were improving the product. They saw themselves as part of the progress the 20th century endlessly promised. Science was a shiny word, bright, impressive, rarely challenged. If adding a mineral made the drink feel modern, then that was progress. No one questioned whether progress needed a boundary. Progress only needed a direction, and for a while, that direction pointed toward a fizzy, lemon-flavored optimism. Eventually, science matured enough to start correcting itself. Regulations arrived. Experts spoke more firmly, studies accumulated, and the quiet assumption that soda could also be a supplement began to fade. The lithium slipped away without protest, without a headline, without a moment of silence. The world turned the page without realizing anything had changed. What remains now is the dreamy absurdity of it all, an absurdity softened by the fact that no harm, no scandal, no panic ever framed the story. It was simply a small, strange thread woven into the fabric of a world that moved too slowly to notice. A world that trusted. A world that didn't demand reasons. A world that accepted its unknowns with a kind of sleepy resilience. And maybe that's what makes the story feel comforting rather than alarming. It reminds us that earlier generations lived inside a haze of undiscovered details and managed, somehow, to live anyway. They didn't have perfect information. They didn't have perfect systems. They didn't have perfect products, but they had enough to get through the day, and that was the metric that mattered. When you revisit that world in your mind, it feels almost peaceful. You can picture the children who drank the lithium soda, unaware of its uniqueness, their lives marked more by sunlight, dust, chores, and long stretches of unstructured time than by anything in the bottle. You can picture the adults, weary but steady, trusting the world not because it was flawless, but because trust was the most practical response to uncertainty. And when you gather those images together, the bottles, the dust, the trust, you begin to understand why the lithium story feels like a lullaby from a forgotten era. A soft, strange comfort from a world that lived without overthinking itself. A world where a mineral slipped quietly into childhood, slipped quietly back out, and left behind nothing more than a drowsy reminder that history is full of tiny mysteries no one bothered to solve at the time. A reminder that life once moved slowly enough for even strangeness to feel ordinary. And the slower you glide through that memory, the clearer it becomes that the entire episode could only have happened in a world that breathed differently. A world without the constant hum of alerts, without the reflexive flinch toward caution, without the instinct to decode every label, every headline, every half-whispered warning. It was a world that allowed odd things to exist quietly, unchallenged, because life itself was already demanding enough. In that world, a soda wasn't an object of scrutiny. It was a small mercy, a way to cool off, a treat for a child who had already spent hours doing what modern childhood would consider wild, unsupervised labor disguised as play. A pause in the day. A tiny sweetness in a life that rarely provided sweetness for free. The lithium was invisible not only because no one looked for it, but because no one thought they needed to. You can picture the rhythm of it all. Adults moving through their routines with a steady, resigned determination, and children moving through theirs with an easy, sun-soaked energy. The soda sat somewhere between them, bridging the two worlds with nothing more profound than a cool bottle and the faint hiss of carbonation. No symbolism. No intentions, just utility. If someone had tried to explain the lithium to an ordinary family of the era, it likely would have been met with a soft blink, a slow nod, and a response along the lines of, well, it tastes fine. Not dismissive, just practical. People didn't rush to outrage because outrage required a level of spare emotional bandwidth they simply didn't have. And so the mineral lived out its quiet career in American childhoods without generating a single fuss. It entered the shelves softly and left the shelves just as softly, like a guest slipping in and out of a gathering where everyone is too busy to turn around. The children kept growing. The parents kept working. The world kept spinning in its unhurried way. The change in formula rippled across the country with all the force of a feather landing in a field. When the story eventually resurfaced decades later, it felt more like a curiosity than a revelation. Not something hidden, but something forgotten. Not a warning, but a wink from a slower, gentler time. People today look back at it with that combination of disbelief and affection reserved for historical quirks that didn't do much. Quirks that simply existed, quietly, until the world grew fast enough to notice them. And maybe that's the real paradox. The story seems strange to us not because it was reckless, but because it was calm. Calm in a way we barely remember how to be. Calm in a way that makes the past feel like a long, drowsy afternoon stretched across decades. A time when life was built from tactile moments, weather, labor, rest, not from information. It's easy to imagine an older adult now, someone who lived through that era without ever realizing its oddness, sitting on a porch and hearing the story retold. They'd laugh quietly, shake their head, and say something like, "We didn't know, but it was fine." And in their voice, there wouldn't be regret or defensiveness, just the simple truth of a life lived within limited knowledge and abundant trust. Because trust in that era was not naive optimism, it was survival. You trusted what you had because you didn't have much, and questioning everything would have stopped life entirely. You accepted the unknowns the same way you accepted the weather, by living through them. And so the lithium in 7-Up becomes not a cautionary tale, but a soft reminder of a vanished emotional landscape. A landscape where the world felt stable enough that even strange details passed without tension. A landscape where people didn't pick apart every corner of their lives. They just carried them, steadily, sleepily, one day at a time. A landscape that feels far away now, but somehow still warm. Still human, still drifting around us like a quiet echo from a time when life was simple enough that even something bizarre could fit in unnoticed, becoming just another thread in the slow, gentle fabric of everyday existence. And as that gentle fabric stretches further, the lithium story starts to feel less like a peculiar footnote and more like an emblem of an era defined by its own soft fog. Not a fog of ignorance, just a fog of pace. A world moving slowly enough that details dissolved before they could become concerns. A world where small mysteries never sharpened into urgency because no one had the luxury to hold them up to the light. In that world, most days were shaped by necessity, not curiosity. You worked until your body reminded you to stop. You rested until the next obligation arrived. You ate what was available, drank what was affordable, and taught your children to do the same. Life narrowed itself into manageable pathways, not because people lacked imagination, but because they lacked time. Questions that didn't promise immediate improvement were quietly set aside, and into that space, calm, tired, spacious, stepped a soda that happened to contain a mood-stabilizing mineral no one had any reason to investigate. If anything, the lithium fit the emotional tone of the era a little too well. Mild, subtle, unhurried. Too small to disrupt the rhythm, too gentle to provoke comment. The children who drank it never paused long enough to register anything unusual. They were busy being children in the old way, darting barefoot across uneven ground, inventing games no adult would understand, filling long stretches of unstructured time with whatever their imaginations scraped together. The adults who handed the bottles to them weren't negligent, they were efficient. They used what worked. They trusted what was familiar. They relied on the quiet assumption that the world would not betray them in small ways because it was already challenging them in big ones. If the drink dulled an afternoon tantrum or softened the edge of a long day, then it had earned its place. What's strangely comforting now is the idea that no one ever formed an opinion about it, no one championed it, no one condemned it. It simply existed, drifting through kitchens and porches and dusty general stores like a background hum that no one bothered to turn off. Its rise and fall were absorbed into life's larger currents without so much as a ripple. When scientists finally traced the chemical, measured it, named it, and suggested it might not belong in a children's drink, the world reacted with the same softness it had shown all along. A small nod, a quiet adjustment, no uproar, no resistance. The formula changed, and people returned immediately to the larger, louder tasks of staying alive. By the time anyone cared to retell the story, It had already transformed into something half factual, half dreamlike. A detail unearthed not because it mattered, but because it fascinates the modern mind. A mind used to vigilance, trained to scrutinize, conditioned to suspect. When we encounter this old oddity, we feel a mixture of disbelief and a faint, nostalgic envy. Because buried inside the lithium tale is a reminder of what it meant to live without constantly checking behind every curtain. A reminder of a world where trust wasn't a liability, just a default. A world where products existed without pressure to justify themselves. A world where people didn't analyze every sip, every breath. They lived through their choices instead of auditing them. And that's why the story lingers so softly today. Not because it warns us, but because it slows us. It invites us into the rhythm of a time when life felt sturdy enough to accommodate the strange without flinching. When a quiet oddity could slip into childhood and slip out again without anyone needing to solve it. A rhythm where history wasn't made through big revelations, but through these small, unexamined gestures. Tiny details that sank into the background until someone, decades later, sifted through them and asked, almost amused, almost sleepy, how did this ever seem normal? And the past, in its calm, steady voice, would probably answer, it was normal because we didn't need it to make sense. We just needed it to get us through the day. And the more you sit with that answer, the quiet practicality of it, the more the entire lithium era takes on the texture of a long, slow breath. A world defined less by certainty and more by momentum. People didn't need everything to make perfect sense. They needed everything to be tolerable. And in that soft, forgiving logic, a soda with a pharmaceutical glint slipped easily into place. Looking at it now, from a world shaped by constant updates and instant reactions, the calmness feels almost unreal. Modern life trains you to look for trouble in every direction. To assume every product hides a flaw, every habit contains a risk, every detail deserves an explanation. But the early 20th century didn't operate on explanation. It operated on endurance. If something didn't immediately break, burn, or bankrupt you, then it was fine. Not ideal, not optimized, just fine. And fine was a luxury. That's why the lithium story feels so dreamlike today. It happened in a world where people weren't chasing perfection. They were chasing stability, predictability, small comforts, ordinary days that didn't collapse under their own weight. In that context, the soda wasn't a chemical experiment. It was a moment of relief you could hold in one hand. Imagine a child walking home in the summer heat, dust clinging to their legs, the sun low and syrupy. They stop by a store, exchange a coin for a cold bottle, and walk the rest of the way sipping something sweet and unfamiliar but pleasant. There is no analysis, no commentary. The drink is simply a companion for the walk, a tiny oasis in a life full of minor discomforts. Whatever else it contains is irrelevant, because childhood itself contains so much else. Work, fatigue, and a kind of spacious boredom modern kids can't imagine. Adults saw the bottle differently. For them, it punctuated the day the way a deep breath punctuates a long sentence. It offered a brief pause before chores resumed, a little sweetness in a world that leaned heavily on bitterness. They weren't thinking about chemistry because chemistry wasn't thinking about them. Science was still a quiet, uncertain thing, providing more questions than answers. So people trusted what was tangible: taste, temperature, familiarity. And the soda satisfied all three. Even the companies behind it never intended a cultural oddity. They believed they were offering something modern, something bright, something improved. The lithium wasn't a secret. It was a selling point, a sign that the drink belonged to a new era of scientific optimism. If only they knew how future generations would blink at that optimism, half amused, half nostalgic for a time when progress still felt gentle. When the lithium disappeared, the shift was as slow and unceremonious as everything else in that era. Perhaps the flavor changed slightly. Perhaps someone commented, "It tastes different," before moving on. But life, with all its unrelenting demands, didn't pause to reflect. The world changed without acknowledging the change. And that's what makes the story so subtle now. It was barely even a story when it happened. Decades later, when the tale resurfaced, it carried with it not scandal, but softness. A reminder that the past wasn't ignorant. It was tired. It was busy. It was practical in ways modern life has forgotten how to be. People didn't need everything to be perfect. They just needed it to be manageable. A soda with lithium was manageable. So it stayed. until science finally caught up and suggested it shouldn't. And now, when we retell the story, it plays back like a lullaby from a different emotional climate. A world quieter, slower, and more trusting than ours could ever be again. A world where strangeness didn't demand confrontation. A world where even something mildly absurd could exist peacefully inside the folds of ordinary life. A world where children drank lithium without knowing it, and adults handed it to them without thinking about it, and history drifted past without making any noise at all. A world not better, not worse, just sleepier. A world that reminds us, softly, that not everything unusual needs to be dramatic. Sometimes it just needs to be normal long enough to become forgotten. And as that forgotten normalcy stretches out in your mind, you start to realize that the lithium story isn't really about chemistry or even childhood at all. It's about the atmosphere of a world where life moved with a kind of gentle heaviness, where people accepted the peculiar simply because they were too occupied with existence itself. A world where small oddities could wander in and out of daily life without causing even the faintest ripple. Imagine the quiet interiors of those early grocery shops, the dim light slanting through dusty windows. Shelves lined not with endless options, but with whatever happened to survive shipping and weather. A storekeeper who knew everyone by name, moving slowly because speed had never been part of his job description. A child pushing the door open, the bell above it barely ringing because its spring was already tired. The soda wasn't an event, it was an afterthought. A background note in a day composed mostly of slow chores and long silences. If the lithium made the drink feel a little cleaner, a little brighter, a little more refreshing than the alternatives, that only helped it settle into place more easily. Adults weren't trying to soothe children chemically. They were trying to keep them hydrated, calm, and out of trouble long enough to finish the day's work. And children weren't sipping with expectation. They were sipping because the bottle felt cold against their palm. The lithium might as well have been stardust for all the attention it received. The world back then didn't have the concept of hidden ingredients. Everything was hidden, and yet nothing was. People didn't expect transparency because transparency required systems that didn't exist yet. They trusted because trust was the only practical option available. You assumed the world wouldn't poison you through something as harmless as a drink, not because you were naive, but because worrying about that would have made life impossible. As the years drifted on, change arrived in the same drowsy way everything else did. Regulations crept forward, slow and bureaucratic. Scientists slowly tightened their understanding of what belonged in food and what didn't. The drink was reformulated not out of panic, but out of a kind of polite course correction. A quiet, administrative decision that slid into daily life with hardly a murmur. By the time people realized the ingredient was gone, they had already moved on to other small adjustments the world kept asking of them. New tools, new jobs, new responsibilities. The lithium era dissolved into memory the same way a bubble dissolves into the surface of a drink, silently, almost immediately. It wasn't until much later, when information became abundant and curiosity became a cultural pastime, that the story was rediscovered. And even then, it didn't provoke outrage. It provoked a slow smile, a raised eyebrow softened by distance, a recognition that the past was full of things that make no sense until you adjust your pace to match it. Because if you slow yourself enough, slow your thoughts, slow your expectations, slow your modern reflex to question, you begin to see how naturally the oddness fit into the texture of the time. It didn't feel bizarre, it felt appropriate, quietly appropriate. The kind of detail that made sense in a world where life itself was heavy, and anything that made a day lighter was welcomed without further inspection. That, more than anything, is the real lesson of the lithium soda. Not a warning, not a critique, just a soft reminder that history isn't built from logic. It's built from tired people doing whatever kept the day moving, even if that meant handing their children a fizzy drink infused with a mineral they didn't know how to pronounce. And now, looking back at it through a modern lens, we can finally appreciate the gentle absurdity of it. A moment in time that feels like an exhale, a yawn, a pause between chapters. A sleepy intersection of trust and convenience. A story that isn't dramatic enough to be alarming, but strange enough to be unforgettable. A story that says, in its own quiet way, people once lived slowly enough that even something odd could feel ordinary, and ordinary enough that no one thought to ask why. And the more you linger in that feeling, that pace, that softness, the more the Lithium era starts to resemble a slow, wandering thought rather than a moment in history. Something you remember only halfway, like the smell of an old house or the sound of boards creaking at night. Not because the memory is vague, but because it never insisted on being remembered in the first place. It simply existed, quiet and unhurried, until the world grew loud enough to look back and notice. In those years, people didn't catalog their lives. They lived them. Entire decades slipped by with no one stopping to draw lines between the normal things and the strange things. Everything blended into one long continuity of work, weather, and small comforts. A drink was not an identity, not a concern, not a topic. It was simply part of the day's texture, like dust on a windowsill or the worn surface of a kitchen table. And if that drink happened to carry a mineral with a calming reputation, then it carried it quietly, without changing the temperature of the world around it. The children who drank it didn't slow down dramatically, didn't drift into unfamiliar states of mind. They remained themselves, scraped knees, tangled hair, muddy shoes, sudden bursts of energy followed by long, contemplative silences only children understand. The lithium dissolved into that rhythm the same way sunlight dissolved into the late afternoon, softening everything without announcing itself. Adults approached the drink from an even more practical angle. They didn't ask whether it was healthy or harmful. They asked whether it was cold enough, whether it quenched thirst, whether it made a small part of the day feel slightly more bearable. They weren't reckless. They were simply occupied, pulled in 100 tiny directions by responsibilities that didn't leave room for speculative anxiety. If the drink had caused obvious trouble, people would have noticed, but it didn't. It remained a quiet companion, neither saint nor villain. And that's what makes the story so gently surreal now. We're used to believing that anything unusual must have caused a reaction, controversy, panic, outrage. But the Lithium era passed through a different emotional landscape, one that didn't rely on vigilance. People accepted what arrived, let go of what disappeared, and rarely asked why either thing happened. Life itself was the obstacle course. Everything else, sodas included, was incidental. It's strangely comforting to picture that world now. To imagine families gathered on porches in the early evening, the heat still clinging to the air, children chasing each other in slow, looping patterns that had no rules. Somewhere inside the house, a grown-up opens a bottle, not out of indulgence, but out of habit. The soft hiss escapes into the room, unremarkable. Another day ending, another night beginning. Nothing to analyze, nothing to fear, just the quiet companionship of a drink that asked nothing of anyone. When the lithium was eventually removed, the world didn't leap or protest. It barely noticed. Modern readers love to imagine turning points, moments when a society wakes up. But this society didn't wake. It rolled over and continued. The drink tasted a little different. Life continued exactly as it always had. Children still ran. Adults still worried about money, land, illness, weather. The minerals slipped out of the recipe with all the grace of a leaf drifting out of sight on a slow river. And perhaps the most remarkable part is how unremarkable it felt. Only later, much later, when the pace of life sped up and the tools for scrutiny sharpened, did the lithium reappear, not in the drink, but in conversation. A rediscovered detail, a soft surprise, a reminder that the past rarely aligns with modern expectations, not because the past was wrong, but because it didn't operate under the same emotional rules. Looking back, we see the oddity clearly, but the people inside that moment never did. They lived too close to the ground, too close to their tasks, too embedded in the thick, quiet fabric of survival to pause and question the fizz inside a glass bottle. And that's what makes the story so tender now. It reflects a time when life trusted itself, even when it shouldn't have, and somehow turned out mostly fine. It invites us to imagine a world where things could be unusual without being alarming, where mysteries could exist without demanding resolution, where small surprises could drift unnoticed through the rhythms of ordinary days. A world slower than ours, softer than ours, a world where strangeness didn't need to be dramatic. A world where even a medicated soda could feel, in its own sleepy way, perfectly ordinary. And the more you sink into that ordinariness, the more the Lithium story feels like a slow-motion vignette from a world that no longer exists. A world that didn't rush to name things, categorize them, warn about them, or elevate them into significance. Back then, significance was earned through hardship, through storms, shortages, illnesses, and the slow grind of work. Everything else was background. And a soda, no matter what it contained, was definitely background. If you look closely at that background, it's full of small, sleepy details. The clatter of wooden crates being unloaded from a truck that didn't hurry because speed wasn't expected. The soft fizz creeping up the neck of a bottle as it's opened. Children leaning against porch railings, taking long, thoughtless sips because they weren't conditioned to expect surprises from their food. The world felt consistent, and consistency made even the strange feel safe. Parents lived with a kind of calm resignation that now seems almost impossible. Their days weren't broken into tasks. They were one continuous task, flowing from sunrise to sunset. There were no micro-decisions, no frantic double-checking, no reading of ingredients or blogs or health advisories. If the community bought something, then the individual bought it. If the product was on the shelf, then it was implicitly trustworthy. Not because the system was perfect, but because the system was familiar. The Lithium didn't disrupt that familiarity. It didn't demand attention. It didn't create new behaviors. It simply nestled into the slow pulse of everyday life, invisible because no one had reason to search for it. Even the doctors of the era were moving through their own fog of partial understanding. They prescribed tonics with ingredients that would be unthinkable today, and people accepted it without hesitation because hesitation wasn't practical. Children, meanwhile, were building their memories in ways that had nothing to do with the drink. They remembered the feel of hot dirt under their feet, the low hum of insects in summer, the smell of their school books, the way time seemed to stretch out forever in the late afternoons. The soda entered those memories only as a texture, cold, sweet, uncomplicated, not as a substance to be scrutinized. What's striking now is how gently everything unfolded. The world didn't need to confront the Lithium. It didn't need to panic or debate. Instead, as scientific understanding deepened and regulations slowly formed, the ingredient drifted out of the formula as quietly as it once drifted in. The company changed their recipe. People kept drinking. Nothing broke. Nothing paused. It's almost funny, in a soft way, that the entire event now feels like a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Even though the people living it never realized they were inside a story at all. They weren't characters. They were just humans moving through time, guided less by information and more by routine. And that's what gives the story its sleepy charm today. It's not dramatic. It's not cautionary. It's not even particularly surprising once you adjust your mind to the tempo of the era. It's simply one more example of how humans navigate life with incomplete knowledge, trusting that the world is mostly benign, or at least manageable. When you revisit that time through a quiet lens, you stop judging and start understanding. You see a world where calmness wasn't a luxury. It was built into the structure of the day. A world that didn't assume danger in every detail. A world that allowed oddities to exist without magnifying them. And maybe that's why the Lithium and 7-Up story feels so soothing now. Not because it was safe, but because it was lived safely. A strange ingredient tucked into a gentle era, softened by the slowness of everything around it. A world where children drank something unusual and adults handed it to them without hesitation, and history itself moved too slowly to notice. A world that now exists only in these quiet retellings, soft, slow, and drifting peacefully just beyond reach. And the longer you stay in that drifting atmosphere, the more the Lithium story stops feeling like an anomaly and starts feeling like a natural consequence of living inside a world built on momentum rather than analysis. People back then didn't audit their own lives. They inhabited them, fully, quietly, without the constant reflex to interpret every detail. The world gave them what it gave, and they moved through it with a kind of tired acceptance that feels almost ancient now. Picture a family in that era, gathering around a kitchen table worn so smooth by time that it almost glowed in the evening light. A child reaches for a cool bottle without thinking, and the parent handing it over is thinking even less. There's dinner to finish, tools to put away, a neighbor's story drifting through the open window. The drink is a footnote. A small punctuation mark in the long sentence of the day. nothing more. And if someone had whispered, softly, gently, conspiratorially, "There's a bit of a mood-stabilizing mineral in that," the reaction would have been a slow blink at most, maybe even a shrug. Not because people didn't care, but because their concern threshold was calibrated differently. Danger had to announce itself loudly to matter. Everything else was just a minor detail in a world already filled with larger, louder challenges. The lithium was far too subtle to disrupt that emotional hierarchy. Even today, imagining the sodium street lamps, the creak of wooden steps, the distant rumble of a passing carriage or early automobile, you can sense how the pace of that world softened everything. Mistakes didn't travel fast. Information didn't travel at all unless someone made the effort to carry it. And so, small curiosities, like a calming mineral in a child's drink, simply dissolved into the flow. Children certainly didn't notice. They weren't raised to investigate. They were raised to participate. Their days were filled with long stretches of unstructured time, boredom that shaped their imaginations, chores that shaped their patience, and small rewards like the occasional fizzy drink. To them, the bottle was not a chemical object. It was a moment. Cold glass, sweet taste, tiny bubbles, a sense of pause. Anything beyond that was beyond childhood's horizon. Adults, for their part, rationed their attention the way they rationed everything else. You saved your focus for things that threatened your family: illness, crop failure, unpredictable weather. A drink couldn't compete with those worries. Even if someone suspected something unusual about it, the thought would have been swallowed by more immediate concerns before forming into anything actionable. And that is what modern readers struggle to grasp: the sheer quietness of the past. A world without pings, alarms, notifications, articles, or warnings. A world where strange things didn't become crises because crises didn't have room to form unless they physically arrived on your doorstep. Information was not a flood. It was a distant trickle you might or might not ever encounter. So when the lithium eventually left the formula, the transition carried the same emotional weight as a leaf falling from a tree, noticed by no one, remarked upon by no one, folded into the background of a life already busy with heavier concerns. Only later, much later, did people turn back and see how curious it all was. Not alarming, not outrageous, just curious. The kind of detail you bring up in a quiet conversation late at night when the pace of the modern world slows just enough to let the old one drift in for a moment. Because what the lithium story really captures is not a mistake, but a mood, a tempo, a softness that we have lost. A reminder that people once lived inside a world where trust was necessary, uncertainty was tolerated, and oddities could flow through daily life without anyone rushing to label them. A reminder that not everything strange is dramatic. Sometimes it's just a quiet detail in a quiet time, disappearing as gently as it arrived, leaving behind nothing but the faintest, sleepiest whisper of a memory. And when you follow that faint whisper long enough, it becomes clear that the lithium story endures not because it was shocking, but because it was so startlingly calm. A quiet artifact from a world that didn't feel the need to interrogate every corner of its own existence. A world where life was lived close to the ground, heavy, tactile, slow, and anything that didn't demand attention simply slipped through the cracks without ever becoming a question. In that world, people moved with a different rhythm. Days didn't scatter themselves into dozens of micro-decisions. They unfolded, steady and unbroken, the way a river moves even when you aren't watching it. And inside that slow current, a soda was not a risk. It wasn't even an object of interest. It was a small luxury, a pleasant moment, a cold bottle passed from one tired hand to another. Children understood even less. Their lives were built around sensations, not scrutiny. The creak of porch steps, the warm metallic scent of dust baking in the sun, the glow of late afternoon light slipping across a yard. A fizzy drink only added another tiny sensory note to that atmosphere, nothing more. No child ever paused mid-sip to wonder whether the calm they felt came from sugar, temperature, or something deeper. They weren't built for that kind of thinking yet, and the era didn't demand it from them. Adults didn't demand it from themselves either. They accepted the unknowns of their world the way modern people accept noise, constantly, unconsciously, without knowing that acceptance is happening. To question everything would have meant slowing down, and no one had time to slow down. Bread had to be baked, coal had to be carried, animals had to be fed, bills had to be paid. Life required motion, not contemplation. The drink, with its small sparkle of modern chemistry, seemed almost refined compared to the rest of their reality. Refined in that dusty, early 1900s way where anything remotely scientific felt like progress, even if no one fully understood why. People didn't crave precision, they craved ease, and the soda, with its mild brightening effect on long days, provided just enough ease to earn a place on the shelf. By the time lithium disappeared from the formula, the world was drifting toward a new phase, still slow by modern standards, but gaining momentum. Information was beginning to sharpen. Curiosity was beginning to organize itself. People were learning to ask questions without needing a crisis to justify them. But even then, the change passed silently. No one mourned the old formula. No one celebrated the new one. The drink tasted close enough to what it always had, and that was sufficient. Only later, when the world had fully awakened into its modern hyper-awareness, did the story return. It resurfaced like a quiet ripple on a still pond, unexpected, faintly amusing, and strangely tender. Not because of the chemistry, but because of the emotional landscape it represents. A landscape where life allowed you to drift a little. A landscape where trust wasn't earned, it was assumed. A landscape where oddities could exist without the need to defend themselves. And as we look back now, the story stops feeling like a curiosity and starts feeling like a window. A slow, dusty window into a time when people lived without the protective vigilance we now consider instinctive. A time when the world didn't demand examinations, it demanded resilience. A time when even a medicated soda could fold itself quietly into daily life without anyone needing to understand it. That, in the end, is the soft truth of the lithium era. It wasn't an event at all. It was an atmosphere, a mood, a slow, drowsy chapter from a world that never paused long enough to realize it was unusual. A world long gone, but still echoing softly each time we remember how quietly strange life can be when no one is watching for strangeness.